Well, this is it. We are into the final full week of campaigning in the federal election campaign, that is. And, of course, voting day is a week today. Advance polls are already set to go. There's been some opportunities for you to mail your vote in, your ballot in. I think tomorrow is the deadline to let them know that that's how you want to take advantage of the vote by tomorrow. Otherwise, this is into the final throes of the campaign. John Wright here with me as usual, and we're happy to welcome in Scot Wright. He is the CEO and the editor-in-chief at The Conversation Canada. Thanks for being here.
Great to be here, gentlemen.
And, you know, I've followed what you guys do at The Conversation with great interest and closely, Scot. And so it's been interesting to see how you and your team have approached, I think I always like to call it the second thing that comes to mind on so many subjects, but certainly on the topics of we should be talking about in the campaign. And, you know, I'm getting great insights from, you know, the folks at The Conversation. But the frustrating part is oftentimes it's guys like us who sit there and talk about it. These are issues that need to be discussed, need to be debated, but are not at all being treated with any seriousness on the campaign trail.
You know, Dave, it's really interesting you say that. You know, my background, I was with Canadian Press for many, many years and oversaw many federal election coverage. And as a younger journalist, was out there doing it myself. And, you know, there's always this struggle about, you know, what issues should be covered versus simultaneously covering the leaders' campaigns. And those two things very rarely line up. So The Conversation, you know, where we work with academic experts, we, you know, do have that ability to look at some issues. Like we published a piece today about what's everyone's policy on cross borders, right, and COVID. And the reality is nobody really has a policy. You know, we looked at housing, we looked at gun controls, and you know our numbers are okay. You know, we're not a mainstream media publication, so we're not getting hundreds of thousands of people reading us. But we are here to try and give people who are looking for some alternative information. But the question, and I would ask both of you this, is do you think people are doing that in this election?
Well, I think actually it's happening around the kitchen table. I mean, to take it back to the basics. And I don't know about you, John. I mean, I know you have a different sense of this because of the way you take the pulse of, you know, where voters are in a given day. But we just had a birthday gathering, for example, at our place here this weekend. And all of the things in some form or fashion that you've identified, John, as being important, and stuff that I have seen come up in The Conversation, Scot, were talked about in some form, maybe not in depth, but it's top of mind for people. And clearly, when they said, well, are you going to vote? And the answer universally was, yeah, I guess. So it leads to a real apathy in the approach to the election, I think, John.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say that, Scot, what we found right out of the gate was the NDP and the Conservatives were actually speaking to those issues which consumers, citizens wanted to hear about: affordability. Yes, the environment was there, but a lot about jobs and the economy. I mean, they weren't at the top of the list. And the fact that the Prime Minister started the campaign without that has led only in the last 2 weeks to the cobbling together of a series of wedge issues. I mean, he's taken the gun issue, the abortion issue, the anti-vax issue, and a bunch of others and kind of tied a string around them and said, there you go. And they're, you know, trying to force people out. I get a sense, though, from the numbers that the people who have voted before who are liberal are having a bit of a difficulty because they may not like the brand, and that the other two are not as scary as they, you know, would be made out to be. But I would also tend to think that there hasn't been a chance for a lot of in-depth discussion. I mean, we're still in that kind of, I won't even say post-COVID time, but you're lucky, Dave, that you had a birthday celebration. A lot of people are still not having that, you know, let's get around the table and, you know, for a certain time, or going out with people and debating it. I will say this, that I was out with, my wife and I were out for dinner on Saturday night with some very dear friends. And the issue of the PPC came up. And that was a 45-minute discussion of people who took it and looked at the anti-vaxxers and looked at protests and then linked it to a whole bunch of other stuff. Outside of that, there was no other discussion on any other issue. So I think they're kind of in tune to it, but I don't know what the turnout's going to be.
It's astounding to me that, first of all, I saw O'Toole today was still bringing up the issue was, why are we having this election, right? Which seems strange when there's an opportunity for him to become prime minister. And virtually every minority government usually defeats itself, and doesn't matter whether it's liberal or conservative. But it is interesting that that's still the issue. But like what John just said, I am so interested in the last week to see what happens with the People's Party popularity. And the weird thing is that until I would say in the last couple of days, that party has got virtually no media attention, which I think is as much a comment on the state of media. I mean, people may have already forgotten, but Bernier took part in the 2019 debates, and actually, got pretty good reviews for his performance. He appeared probably more moderate than he really is, and wasn't in these debates, and yet I think it's John, it's safe to say that party has gained more support in the polls than any other party since the start of the election. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think, again, for new listeners to us, which there are lots every time we do this, I mean, you have to go back to the week of August the 10th, and you will find the PPC at 1%. And then you start to see in the weeks afterwards, right up until I'm looking at numbers now, I mean, we're up to almost 6%, an average across the country of about 5.4%. And the first thing is, well, why is this happening? Well, it's coincidental with the introduction of the passport in Quebec. That was the first time that it was talked about and it picked up steam. And then we're having it in Ontario. There's been big discussions about that and in other places. So the first thing is it's provided a bit of a vessel for those who are pushing back on it. They're not all anti-vax. Some of them are actually science-based, where they say, I don't know what the implications are on DNA long term. And you may disagree with that, but they have some legitimate concerns. There are also going to be people who, when confronted with, and I mean, other people confronted with people who say, well, you got to get your kid under 12 vaccinated. They may say, well, listen, I'm double, but I think I'll hold off for a while on the kid. There's a confrontation that's starting to take place. And so I wouldn't call the PPC nowadays the People's Party. I'd actually refer to it as the Liberty Party. The Liberty Party, in my mind, is made up, when you look across the demographics, of people who look just like you and me. They're educated. The strata is right across the board. I mean, they're not older. Only 35% of them have Trumpian views. 2/3 of them do not. But they're all focused around this thing of, don't do the passport. And they're joined now by the others who are, keep your hands off my land. Don't touch my responsible guns. I'm a libertarian. That's all coming together. And Bernier is providing that. So I agree with you that the media has, I don't think in a conspiratorial sense, but the media has not talked about it at all and hasn't give rise to why this is happening. But they also haven't talked about the protests. I mean, and what's behind it and what's driving this. So I think, though, that it's something we have to be careful and watch about for the obvious pushback pieces. But in terms of the landscape, these people are very, very driven to vote. But they're coming from all three or four of the parties. They're not just coming from the Conservatives. And I would say that if we have a minority government this time, I don't know whether they're going to get any seats, but my goodness, they're going to be ready the next time if there is a minority government to go out and make a mark. No question in my mind.
So it's interesting when you talk about the media's role in this, Scott, because as you were talking, I saw a headline here from the Washington Post published just this morning. Who is Maxime Bernier, the far-right politician compared to Trump, could help Trudeau in Canada's election? And it's obviously a simple version of the role Bernier plays in Canadian politics. But to John's point, it's not only that the media has not reported on this, they have not understood what's been behind that wave of popularity now, and in as much as identifying that level of anger that's out there and taking it seriously. And I think we ignore it at our peril.
Absolutely. One of the things, I was talking to a few analysts over the weekend, and the media in the U.S. Completely underestimated that anger in 2016 and even again in 2020. And I wonder, is it being underestimated here? And again, at what cost? And I think it is something. Like, I grew up in Chatham, Ontario. A lot of this anger has been from that kind of swath from, the 905 down towards the London Chatham area. I don't understand it, and I do agree with John that I think it comes from different people, but this anti-science and anti-knowledge thing is very worrisome. We've been running this series since the beginning of June on, taking questions from the public and trying to get experts to answer it, and I think that's good. But there's also a level of the population now who doesn't care. Doesn't care what the science and the facts say. And that's the thing that, as a citizen and as a journalist, really angers me.
Well, I think a level of that, though, is, and I don't want to pick on the media, but I think I can pick on the media here a little bit, is the notion that we need to be telling stories through good storytellers. Kevin Newman was on Tony Chapman's podcast last week, and they were talking about 9/11. And 20 years ago this weekend was really sort of when Global News launched their national newscast. It was only a couple of days before 9/11. And Kevin took the moment to illustrate how important media was on that particular day in making sure that we all had context and understood where we are. Look where we are 20 years later, Scott, in terms of what this media landscape looks like. You look back at your days at CP, it resembles nothing of what it was like when you were there. When I was the news director at News Talk 1010, no resemblance whatsoever. They don't even have a newsroom. So how do we get to that point? As frustrated as guys like you and I may be, and I think it's rightly placed and situated, what's the answer there? Because how do we get to a point where we can inform, and maybe it's unvarnished issues that we're going to have to deal with, but that the general public is in a place where they're more receptive to it? Now, is that just a matter of media trust? What's going on?
Look, I think social media, Facebook, which I think is a big part of the problem, and the other platforms, have just allowed, I used to say that all this stuff happened in coffee shops, right? And beer parlors where people would get together and complain, and they would have similar voices. And now there's just such easier places for people to gather and spread falsehoods and rumors. And again, I don't know how much you can change. Like, one of the things that we've learned in the stories we've done is one of the key areas of research shows that people who are either, you want to call them vaccine hesitant rather than anti-vaxxers, right? Mm-hmm. a slight difference, but these are people who do not have a family doctor, and they tend to be in that 18 to 35, 45 area, age range, right? Where for whatever reason they've chosen not to have a family doctor because they're not sick that often, maybe they don't have kids, or it's just actually difficult in some parts of this country to have a doctor. So the research has shown that one of the places that people will turn for advice, trusted advice, is from their own family doctor. So, that would be one area, but there's always going to be a percentage of the population who just aren't going to take it because they are libertarian. They don't trust anyone, and I don't know, what the media can do more about that. We can't convince everyone.
No, I get it. But I think we've kind of gnawed off our leg in all of this, and it's a little hard to have a running start at any kind of momentum around making sure that the information is robust and contextualized accordingly. We're eating our young in many respects as far as the media is concerned. But when we look at how that's playing out, though, John, without a real ballot question, we're struggling to get to a point where we have a population that trusts the media, and a significant part of that group. I don't like the hyperbole of saying, this may be the most significant election we've ever seen, but for a lot of reasons, it may well be.
Well, it may well be because it ends in a stalemate, just like we've had before, and we have decisive issues that we have to deal with in our society. I think the second thing, though, is that having not faced a pandemic, we are now about to face. If you go way back in the podcast last year, I think it was, Dave, we talked about, our response, our recovery, and then our reckoning. I think we're kind of at the beginning of the reckoning stage. And I think part of that is we have to have discussions about uncomfortable truths. And it may not be the truth of medicine. It may simply be the truth of it. It's like having this discussion the other night. It was kind of like it took 45 minutes to get to the stage where you could actually have a discussion rather than, I was violently agreeing with them and I was still getting it. It was kind of like, so what do we do with these 4.5 million adults? We can't chase them down and put them in concentration camps or stick them and jab them. I mean, what are you going to do when it's this pushback? So I think we have to have that uncomfortable, truth discussion. The second thing, though, is that we haven't even thought about is what role does this now put the politicians in? Because they have either politicized those groups or they will be politicized by those decisions. So let's take Doug Ford in the province of Ontario, who is a conservative. And if he decides to step down certain things in order to legitimately stop protests or combustible activities, he may be accused of appeasement to the very group that's peeling off the right part of his party. You see what I mean? It's like, so I think the argument is really something we haven't embraced yet, and that is up until this point, we've let the government and the medical officials essentially run our lives. We've reacted to everything. The opening of the Blue Jays games were something to celebrate in the sense that an entrepreneurial group was actually doing something on their own. Even though they had limits, they were saying, okay, we're back to business. Some kind of normal is 15 out of 50,000 people. We have people in office buildings who are saying, you know what, next quarter, we're starting to get back into it. I think what this is calling for is a broader tent. And this is part of the combustible thing that we're going to fall into. There are more people to make decisions now as opposed to simply the medical crew and the political crew. As an example, I don't know how they define restaurant, but if you're going to keep patrons out of restaurants, I'm just going to say, McDonald's. I don't know whether that qualifies or not because it is sit down when you go to a number of them. Who's going to enforce that? Does that chain want that responsibility? Are they going to say, no, I'm sorry, we can't do this? Like, what is government and these medical folks then putting on outsiders, and where do they have a chance to have input? So I think the next phase of the reckoning is actually to open up these discussions. It's going to be really tough to do, but we've so highly polarized ourselves saying these guys have got the right answers and you people don't, that now we need to get back into it and say, well, honestly, we got to work our way through this, and not every politician or healthcare worker is going to, give us the right answer. But even if it's not the right answer, how are we going to make it through to the next part of our living together? And I think that's not just philosophical. It's where we are right now. And we got to find a mechanism to deal with it.
Turning that temperature down, then, Scott. Two dangers for the next government in Ottawa. One is that you seem to be downplaying it, or on the other hand, you just don't show enough courage to actually get to the point where you have to do something, to John's point, about it.
I think there's another reckoning coming, and that's of the majority of the people who have done the right thing, who've gotten the vaccine, who wear the mask, and they're just fed up with government who is not responding to this minority. And I think that, so yes, you don't want the poor minimum wage kid at McDonald's standing at the front getting yelled at by somebody who doesn't want to wear a mask. But if everybody, if we reach herd immunity through vaccination, that wouldn't have to happen. And, I'm sorry, I need to have a license to drive a car. There are rules and regulations in this country. And if some people don't want to get vaccinated, that's fine. But there have to be repercussions if we're going to live together as a civil society, and also try and get back to, economic recovery. Like I live in the west end of Toronto along Queen Street, and I look at all of those empty stores. And our office where I'm today is at Bay and Bloor, and I look, and there's so many empty stores, and I just feel some of these people I would go and have lunch there every day, and where are those jobs? They're all gone, right? So I understand for the first year and a half why, but there's no reason now why those businesses couldn't be coming back. And I do think that enough people are just going to be fed up with that. And so let's stop worrying about the people who don't want to get it. And let's start, essentially, if you want to call it punishment, so be it.
Yeah, I want to jump in and say, my first reaction is exactly that. So I agree with you. I've double vaxxed. My family is. I want to get on with my life too. So, but two things. Number one is I recognize that having that group of people, which is equivalent to 4.5 million people in this country, are not going to go quietly. And I also now have to trade off the potential pushback from them. And if I'm prepared to take that, well, then that's okay. But there may be consequence to it. The second thing, though, is my wife and I are very fortunate this week in a way, and that is two of our kids are back at university. One at Queen's and one at Dalhousie. And for the first time, we actually had a house to ourselves. And so we went out for the big date on Monday night. We went to Dairy Queen up on Pottery Road. So we're there at Dairy Queen. We got our masks on, and the two of us are standing in line with a whole bunch of other two people, couples all the way down. And the lineup's really big into the parking lot. We finally get up to the door, and you look inside, and there's two people. And then they're ordering it, and then they have to stand on the other side of Dairy Queen while they hand them their milkshake or their ice cream cone. And I turn to my wife and say, for God's sake, at what point can a group of us go in here? I mean, I've been living like this as well. And the last thing I heard was we got to now go to 90% vaccination before we can return to normal. So I think, to your point, there's going to be pushback on two fronts. There's going to be pushback against those people, who are not liking what they're being excluded from. But I think there's also going to come a time where we're going to push back and say, how come we can't do this? I mean, We've taken almost 2 years of our lives or a year and a half of our lives to do the right thing, and we can't even go in and, do the sort of things that we want to do. So I think that speaks to the fact that we're going to have significant pressure, and it's a different pressure than it was before, and it may come from different angles. And I'm not really sure that the politicians are up to dealing with that at the moment. I don't think there's the mechanism or the apparatus or the viewpoint to actually reconcile that sort of stuff.
So how do we get to next Monday, Scott? What's going to happen?
Geez, I wish I knew. I do think it appears to me that where we are now is where we were in 2019. The Liberals dipped before hit their floor before the debates. The Conservatives hit their ceiling right before the debates, and now they seem to be leveling off. And I think the more important question is, if it's a minority government, no matter what happens. History shows that a lot of stuff happens during minority governments, and we shouldn't listen to the politicians. Is sometimes minority governments are good. What's not good is, whoever's in power always is looking for an advantage. And it'll be really interesting if the Liberals get in with a reduced minority and what happens to Trudeau, and you've got a couple of people just waiting in the wings, and then it gets really interesting. But that's for political animals like us to like.
Well, I think the reality, though, is, John, one of the things that did come up over the weekend is, oh my God, we're going to be back into this in the next 2 years.
Yeah, and that's
starting to dawn on people.
Yeah, and I didn't detect any noticeable change in people's attitudes, either I got to get out and vote versus, I just don't want to get out and vote. I mean, it's just kind of like, do we have to do this again? And I don't think it's going to get into yet another discussion about, representation and votes and all that sort of stuff. Look, I think there are a couple of big wild cards on election night. One is our reaction to going to vote during a COVID-related period and how we're going to, do that, whether it has an impact on that. The other point is that between the last time we talked and now, I think that we're up to 3 million voters by mail. Is that right? I mean, we've got a lot more people who are doing so, and we may not know the results in many ridings until 2 days later. So I think right now, heading into the home stretch, we're kind of back where we were just as the election was called. although the Tories seem a little further back than that. But for the Liberals to recover and have a meaningful majority, I don't think at the moment is foreseeable unless there's this huge rally. So we are kind of going to be back where we started from, and then there'll be questions about Mr. Trudeau's, longevity in his own party and Mr. Bernier and what he's going to bring to the table next time.
Hey, John, if I could ask you one question that I'm curious about this time is that, if I'm Jagmeet Singh, I gotta just feel so bad because the guy is a pretty good campaigner. I think he comes across as the most authentic of the leaders, when you see him in public. And I think that is important to a lot of voters. And yet he always seems to lose out, can't ever really get above that 20%. Is there a chance this time, do you think that people may just say, well, I am going to vote for him? It's been my sense last time was that people maybe liked the guy, but were more worried about a conservative thing, so they switched to Liberals. What do you think? Is there a chance that the NDP may do better this time?
No, I don't think they will, Scott. The biggest problem that the NDP have is Quebec. So, yeah. I mean, you're left to, run around and see if you can pick up an extra seat in Toronto. And then out west, they're crushing it as of today in British Columbia. And that's where he started his campaign and where he is today. I don't think so. I think, however, there may be soft Liberals who have decided that they do want change, and they're likely older Liberals who have said, I think I've had enough and I want to change. The NDP make a safe place for them to go. It's Mr. Trudeau's worst nightmare because it's the people that he needs to come back. He doesn't need to get Tories. But I think we may be surprised on election night that he'll do better than he's doing today in the polls, but I don't think he's going to clear the hurdles he wants to have the kind of representation in the 21, 22, 23% that I think he would hope. I think it's a very regional thing. He just hasn't got the support. He needs, 25 seats in Quebec easily to become a serious for. I don't think that's going to happen for a bunch of reasons that we all know exist in the province of Quebec.
Well, let's leave it there. Scot, Wright, thanks for joining us. It's been great to have you join the conversation, so to speak, today with us here on the WRIT Race. It's good to have you.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. Enjoy it, and everybody should get out and vote.
I'm Dave Trafford. He's John Wright. This is the WRIT Race. It's an Eye Contact podcast.